I would like to hand the microphone off to my colleague on the steering committee, Rogan Kirsch, who's the provost at Wake Forest University. I could say so much about Rogan. I'm going to say just a few things. Rogan is a political scientist trained at Yale who came to Wake Forest from NYU, where he served as Associate Dean of the Wagner School of Public Service. He's an elected fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration, and he has professional experience in the US Congress, in the British Parliament, and in Tokyo. Rogan will introduce today's keynote speaker. So you can all wake up now. It's time to come back to life. Thank you, Rogan.
Oh, goodness. Thank you, Rick. What a wonderful overview, both of where we've come and where we hope we're headed, and also the spirit that informs this gathering that's kept so many of us in the core group that's really worked through some of the initial thoughts and engagement around life transformative education. So lovely to have you set the tone as you did, and I know you've got us all primed for what's ahead. In Cheryl Kaiser's spirit of gifting, we are the beneficiaries today indeed of the presence of my colleague and dear friend, Jonathan Lee Walton. One quick run of a show or a housekeeping note before I provide a brief introduction. Dean Walton will share wisdom with us for 20 minutes or so. Then another of our CLTE core committee colleagues, Bates College President Clayton Spencer, whom Rick name-checked just a moment ago, will offer an initial discussion prompt, first to Dean Walton and ideally to us all. We will aim thereafter for a conversational engagement across the group. Dean Walton is, among many things, a magnificently gifted teacher, and I've seen him in action, and he knows well that genuine exchanges, even on Zoom screens, make for the most memorable sessions. So some words from Dean Walton, a prompt from President Spencer, and then after Jonathan has responded initially to that, I very much hope we will all dig in. As far as introduction, happily, you've got Jonathan Lee Walton's bio on your conference webpage. Let me just add the 3 points that might not be evident there. First, Dean Walton is a child of the American South. He grew up in Atlanta and spent his undergraduate years at Morehouse College. He then spent many sojourning years in the wilderness at distant outposts like Princeton and Harvard before coming home to North Carolina and specifically Wake Forest. Second, part of Dean Walton's global reputation, for so it is, owes to his scholarly prominence across the fields of theology, social ethics, race, and political culture. Just as one example, his ideas and words are featured repeatedly and prominently in the definitive study of the Black Church, the book of that name that came out just a few months ago by Henry Louis Gates. And Dean Walton's reputation also arises from his remarkable work as the head of Harvard's Memorial Church, perhaps the best known university chapel in America, which he figuratively and literally rebuilt. Memorial Church, under Dean Walton's leadership, famously drew congregants, including many, many students, in numbers that university chapels had not seen for years. I've been privileged to see him perform the same magic here at Wake Forest as Dean of Wake Chapel, along with serving as Dean of our Divinity School. I've been indeed in this work privileged to see personally his generosity of spirit and love for each student, each staff member, each faculty member, each community visitor, each returning alumnus. This is the key to his own life transformative work as an educator and pastor. I'm so thrilled to turn now to the generous gift that is Dean Walton's time with us today.
Wow. Thank you, Brother Kirsch. I appreciate that, my dear friend. And listen, and thank you to you all of the members and participants and the Coalition for Life Transforming Education, particularly the steering committee and Rick Miller, and those who invited me to share with you today. I have become familiar in recent weeks with your work and the extraordinary value of the contributions to your work at academia. I also must say I've learned enough about your organization and the incredible minds that are on the screen to actually second guess why in the world I agreed to sit here as a keynote speaker in the first place. But I have learned enough in these types of environments to know that The best thing that I can do is stay in my lane, because whenever I pivot, there's most likely somebody who knows a whole lot more about the subject than I do. So I am going to stay in my lane. And for a few moments before we open it up to dialogue about my initial reflections, I want to talk about from the theme Paideia and Piety, the value of a university church, the value of a university church. So I am a theological educator. This is my profession. This is my vocation. To be sure, following what I interpret to be my sense of call has taken me along a few twists and turns over the past 25 years to get here. It's been a somewhat unique route to my current role as Dean of the University-based Divinity School here at Wake Forest, as well as the Dean of a University Church, Wake Chapel. But actually my career began as a church kid nurtured by local communities of faith in Atlanta. Loving, tender, and proud people who valued the life of the mind and the life of the spirit. Progressive African-American Protestant communities of faith who deemed the educational pursuit as sacred and saw intellect as liberating. The quest for literacy and learning, both, it was an extension and an expression of one's faith. That's the context that I grew up in. And whereas so many of these precious people had reasons, and they had empirical evidence if they used their reasoning and rationale and their ability to process data, they had reasons to throw in the towel due to the pains, problems, perils, and perplexities associated with Black life in America. But these people had something more. A conception of the divine and sacred narratives that inverted the prevailing logics of power, privilege, and persecution. So I'm talking about a beloved community of faith, a community that imbued this young Black kid with confidence, instilled self-esteem, and provided an external armor from an internal dignity and sense of self-worth. And so anything good that I am, which is a few things compared to the highly problematic parts of my personality, anything good I trace to those people. And I also have to say, to be sure, I don't mean to be hagiographic here, because like all communities, these precious people had their blind spots. Like all people, they could be given to altruism and avarice, beneficence and bigotry. For instance, my testimony that I just gave you may be quite different if my body had not been appropriately masculine and presumably heterosexual. I can't gloss over such an important caveat. But I also know the rich corroborating evidence of this tradition that cuts across varying identities. These sacred spaces at their best, provided a countercultural message of inspiration and affirmation. As I heard often growing up, fleecy locks and dark complexion cannot forfeit nature's claim. Skin may differ, but affection dwells in black, brown, and white the same. If I was tall as to reach the poles or grasp the ocean at a span, I will be measured by my soul, because the mind and the heart are the standards of a man and a woman. And it was this, marinated in this rich tradition, that yours truly was licensed into ministry before graduating college. And I was part of a ministerial staff in suburban Atlanta that witnessed a congregation swell from roughly 500 to 5,000 members in about 5 years. We were a part of a Protestant trend known as the megachurch phenomenon, which swept the United States in the Southern crest in the late 1980s and 1990s. Oh, it was an intoxicating time. Theological orientation, denominational affiliations, ecclesiastical traditions, they all started to get rolled up into the paper of religious consumerism and seeker-friendlyism. And so because we were all getting rolled into that paper, it was hard to avoid getting high from the contact smoke of bigger is better. And by the time I started graduate school, which actually I saw Clayton Spencer as an exit ramp out of the church, because I had more questions than answers. And by the time I started graduate school, I mean, it was the words of another boy preacher, James Baldwin, who was constantly haunting me. As Baldwin wrote in The Fire Next Time, being in the pulpit was like being in the theater. I was behind the scenes and I knew how the illusion worked. So graduate school, it offered what I felt to be a vocational lifeline. I found a new career path. Pastoral ministry was too paradoxical of a profession. Congregational ministry was too arduous of an existence for me. In the church, I felt like I would need to be an ethical contortionist. You got to be a moral visionary and a shrewd diplomat. You have to offer moral challenge while affirming the bourgeois markers of social status. You got to remain unfazed by the vanities of a materially obsessed culture while serving as chief fundraiser to outfit the church with the latest creature comforts. No, I couldn't do that. The academy offered me my new professional path because there's no professional contradictions there. Yeah, my commitment to truth, justice, and mercy could occur behind a podium, not a pulpit. Research, teaching, scholarship, academic freedom. The academy, I thought, would offer an idyllic refuge. It was the moral ideal of higher education and broad-based liberal education that sold me. It felt consistent with the intellectual freedoms that I witnessed as a child in progressive pulpits. And it was consistent with the religious ideals of educators like Benjamin Elijah Mays and Mary McLeod Bethune that I embraced at Morehouse College. People who taught me that the pursuit of knowledge and truth is not value neutral. Or as Daniel Coit Gilman, as he professed at the inauguration of Johns Hopkins University, he said, the object of a university is to develop character. It misses this if its aim is producing learned pedants or simple artisans or cunning sophists or pretentious practitioners. Its purport is not so much to impart knowledge to pupils as to whet the appetite, to exhibit methods, to develop powers, to strengthen judgments, to invigorate the intellectual and moral forces. Yeah, that's the ticket, I thought. Academe would be my Trojan horse. I say Trojan horse because I believed that my intellectual and religious commitment aligned. I believe that they aligned. But that was not the case within most departments of the study of religion and even divinity schools. Because increasingly throughout the 20th century, the prevailing sentiment offered objectivity as the antithesis of spiritual affectivity. And religious practice undercut academic rigor. The stoicism of Athens was not compatible with the tear-soaked compassion of Jerusalem. So even though I personally continued to affiliate and even serve local congregations while in graduate school and on the tenure track initially, I did so largely in secret, lest anyone think that I was not a serious scholar of religion. But by the time I was up for tenure at my previous institution, I learned to bifurcate these identities pretty well. Again, certainly it was part external cultural pressure, the logics of the academy, being at high ranked, top tier research universities. And part of it was internal professional anxiety of a Southern African American kid who preferred to be viewed as anything but a racial or a religious trope within higher education. It's interesting how life works, isn't it? Because by the time I was going up for tenure, I was now saying being in the academy was like being in the theater. I was behind the scenes and I knew how the illusion worked. But exactly a decade ago, right at the time that I earned tenure, I was presented an extraordinary opportunity. Following the death of the legendary minister, Peter Gomes, a few divinity school faculty members at Harvard and local religious leaders were asked to fill in at the memorial church each week. And I was asked to serve on an advisory board to help select the new minister. And after having filled in a couple of times, one fall day, President Drew Faust called me into her office to let me know that she had received some letters from Memorial Church congregants nominating me for the role. And it was a very interesting conversation. Clayton Spencer will correct me if I'm not getting this right, but the conversation was really interesting because President Faust, she said, "You're ordained?" That's what she asked me. And I said, "Yes." She said, "You've served in congregations?" And I said, "I have." And she said, "Well, it's nowhere on your CV. Why didn't we know this about you?" And I responded, because I suspect that if the search committee that hired me for the faculty knew that, I wouldn't be on the faculty right now. To which President Faust raised an eyebrow, smiled, and said, "Good point. And that saddens me." But President Faust, along with my dear friend and mentor on this call, afforded me an opportunity of a lifetime. The chance to merge professional and personal identities, the opportunity to integrate my sense of vocation as a theological educator, an opportunity to unapologetically pursue intellectual inquiry with religious commitment. And taking the helm of the Memorial Church at Harvard University provided the opportunity to place veritas, truth, and caritas, love, in creative tension at the center of a university. And whereas the very concept of a university church strikes many as an oxymoron, a contradictory formulation, I now understand university and church as complementary. For this is the aim of a liberal arts education, helping students to learn how to hold animating impulses and worlds in creative tension. Yes, we're called to pursue veritas. We are committed to expanding both knowledge and ways of knowing. The ancient Greeks referred to it as paideia, seeking truth, knowledge toward becoming positive, productive citizens of the polis. Yes, absolutely. but we also pursue caritas, the Latin term for love and charity, extending ourselves to others. At Wake Forest, we call it pro humanitate, for humanity. The ability to give ourselves to causes greater than ourselves. Thomas Aquinas considered caritas the greatest of the three theological virtues, because charity is greater than hope and more important than mere faith, because it's faith in, but more importantly, hope for, actualized in practice. What are we hoping for? And how does that animate our moral and ethical life? It both reflects and glorifies love, because it's an expression of how that love is to be extended to a neighbor. Not love as sentimentality, nor love as an emotional erotic feeling, but love as a moral ethic informed by a concern for the other, namely justice. Some refer to it as agape. So like paideia, agape, caritas, love, it's a form of virtue cultivation. It's a tradition of piety that pulls upon communal resources of the past to speak to pressing needs of the present. And one of the most prevalent collective resources of the past that connects communities to build upon and move beyond our moral obligation is religious faith. That Latin verb, religare, to rebind, to reconnect, that which links humanity to that which links humanity to a deity, that which links humanity to ultimate values and concerns that we deem sacred, that a community deems sacred. Values and ultimate concerns that are so often passed down through sacred narratives. And it's these sacred narratives which sit at the core of religious identity that bind and connect us to one another. And they're working and operating in communities, even when we willfully ignore them and or deny them. To be sure, I understand and am quite hypercritical of the ways that many such narratives erect walls of distinction and division. But at their best, they connect us across time, space, and culture toward underscoring the best of humanity. This is why colleges and universities, in my view, cannot afford to surrender the realm of religion, either facilitating the critical study of or the practice of. This is why, in my view, colleges and universities must take seriously the role that religious traditions play in shaping intellectual and moral dispositions for good and for ill. An agnostic position renders us derelict of duty. Faith informs the intellectual, the moral, the ethical life. For instance, I've talked about me personally. Anybody who's ever received a piece of correspondence from me, whether it's an email or a letter, you know that I always sign off one love. That's my complimentary close, one love. I spell love, L-U-V. I don't have a reason or rationale. I just kind of started thinking I was a cool cat, so I started doing that. No reason. But I sign off one love. This is taken from a quotation from former scholar of religion, educator, and president of Morehouse College, as well as dean of Howard Divinity School, and Bates College graduate, class of 1921, Benjamin Elijah Mays. He wrote in a 1957 book, Seeking to be Christian in Race Relations, the love of God and the love of humanity are indeed one love. What Mays is doing, he's uniting the object of his faith with the community of humankind, believing that he's called to serve both. He combines the inspiration and animating impulse driving his moral action with those who he's been called to serve. And here he acknowledges that the ultimate and the immediate, the transcendent and the immanent, the infinite and the finite are always inextricably tied together. So for him, you can't say that you love a God that you've never seen and ignore those who you walk beside each day. Conversely, you cannot give yourself to a cause or pursue an ultimate concern, whether it be the pursuit of truth, justice, or even physical healing, and not acknowledge that our intellectual and physical labor is tied to a world so much greater than ourselves. A sacred world, even. Holding multiple worlds in tension, I believe, is the role of a university church. A university church, like any classroom or laboratory on campus, ought to be a safe space where no question is off limits. We celebrate traditions toward building upon and moving beyond our usable past for future generations to come. And we explore varying conceptions of the sacred toward better appreciation, understanding, and ethical engagement of varying communities and cultures across space and time. In other words, we're doing the work of educating minds and expanding hearts unapologetically. But university churches could also offer something different if done well. Because unlike the experience of many classrooms, a university church can also constitute a place where rank, status, professional identity, and dare I say, just damn near pretentiousness can be suspended at the door. Yes, it's a place where we bring big questions, like the classroom. We tackle big questions. But it's also a place where, unlike the larger culture of a hyper-competitive top-tier college or university, spaces like Wake Chapel can also be a safe refuge to help students cultivate other skills and dispositions. Because in most of our spaces on campus, most of those spaces are dedicated to winning, dedicated to being on top. Where can we all go to acknowledge our frailty, to admit our insecurities, to embrace our distinctiveness, and even celebrate our quirkiness with the blessed assurance that, as in my tradition, you're made in the imago Dei, the image of God. So we often talk about leadership and character or well-being, but central to leadership and character is epistemic humility. Learning to make peace with the absurdities of life, learning to conceive that there are some realities, experiences, and tragedies that we'll never be able to control nor make sense of. So in other words, a university church can be a countercultural moral compass to an otherwise hyper-competitive landscape. We're preparing tomorrow's global leaders. And they need to hear from somewhere that invincibility is not a virtue, nor is vulnerability a vice. They need to hear that all of us have benefited from somebody else's grace, as well as we've all benefited from our previous faults and failures. And university churches can create spaces that let students know that they aren't the masters of their fate. They aren't the captains of their souls. Colleges and universities have the material and intellectual resources to invest in such spaces, spaces that can be centers of ethical inquiry and debates, centers of thoughtful considerations on happiness, physical and mental well-being, purpose, social relationships, and centers for people who considers what it means to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. If we as educators abdicate this responsibility to somebody else somewhere else, then we aren't taking seriously paideia and piety. I've talked enough. Let's open this up for a conversation.
Hi, Jonathan. Thank you. It's so wonderful to hear your message and your voice again. Having been one of the many people who streamed back into Harvard's Memorial Church when Jonathan arrived in the pulpit. So I've been asked to ask a question that might open up some discussion. And there's so much here, it's hard to pick, but let me start with something easy. You said that universities cannot afford to surrender religion, which actually grounds and animates the intellectual and moral dispositions that make us who we think we are, right? But you're here at a session on life transformative education, which uses the distinctively secular terms of making sure students graduate with a sense of identity, agency, and purpose. And my guess is you would link all of those to the deeper moral framework you have suggested. So here's my question. It feels like colleges and universities, certainly the elite colleges and universities you referred to, have already surrendered religion. And even if one accepts as true and insightful the claims you make for the university church, it's a marginal enterprise at best. And I know it's not conceptually marginal in your view. So how do we think about well-being if we're not willing to do the work to bring that more centrally? And how do you find the armor to charge into battle? You did today, which is great. But how do you, is it important to you to get the attention of the higher education establishment on this question? And what are the consequences if you don't really get the attention or persuade?
Yeah.
I told you it was easy.
It's a really easy question. I appreciate that, President Spencer. You are correct in terms of, yes, many colleges and universities have abdicated that space. They've abdicated for intellectual reasons, of which I touched on. It's kind of as developed over the 20th century that were loaded with, now even scholars are acknowledging in social sciences and humanities, all kind of epistemic bias, right, as it relates to things such as objectivity. But it's also been abdicated because there's a growing sense of the secularization of society, right? And so some might say, well, look at something like nuns, the growth of nuns. Why would we invest resources? when so many of our students actually identify as atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular? Well, I guess my response to that would be, yes, that may be true. We have seen a growth of this category of the nones. We have seen a hyper-secularization of society. But even with the category of the nones, a critical mass of those persons, according to the social science data, still actually profess a belief in God. They just choose not to affiliate with any quote unquote one singular religious community. Sometimes we call this the spiritual but not religious crowd. And it's often young people, oftentimes young people, another reason that they're often identifying, because they have come to conceive of religion only according to the most extreme, exclusive, and intolerant examples. So their professed rejection of religion is often informed by an embrace of a singular conception of the sacred. It's almost like a logic, like religion is hateful. I don't want to be hateful, so I reject religion. I'm a non. And this is still a theological commitment because the negation is informed by a belief in the original premise. So even here, this is something that should be part of our intellectual and moral vocabulary. But even still, I'll give another reason, because I know I'm talking to high-powered administrators here who actually have control of some purse strings. Even still, researchers have studied the rise of whether it's secularized society or the nones and or religious disaffiliation, and the deleterious implications and impact of it on communities and on our students. I mean, Robert Putnam waved the flag on this over a decade ago. When people neglect even religious association, they negate civic participation. And religious communities are one of the few bastions of community engagement. And there's also this correlation between disaffiliation, particularly students. We know this from data. I know Brother Rogan studies this. Students who identify with the spiritual but religious banner, and this kind of privatization of religion that's probably born of neoliberal logics, if we're honest. This kind of interiorization of religious faith, it undercuts group solidarity, social commitments. And what's it do? It leads to higher levels of loneliness and depression. So that's why I think in reinvesting in faith communities and the sacred and religious life, it's an investment in the emotional health and well-being of our students. I'm a huge advocate of mental health counseling, huge. But I also believe that there are some things that we shouldn't pathologize or label as traumas just because they're part of otherwise normal dimensions of intellectual and adolescent development. So students are going to fail. We all suffer defeat. We all must wrestle with disappointment. And there's a wealth of resources and knowledge is available in our religious and spiritual faith traditions to provide students with emotional buoyancy. And I want us to do so.
We are hearing heartfelt proclamations and in a very challenging space. And President Spencer, thanks so much for opening this up. And to Dean Walton, oh my goodness. Big hug coming your way when I see you next. Love to hear other voices. We have other prompts organized, but you all have been unusually engaged for a group of high-powered and very busy administrators. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. And the gauntlet is down. Please take it up as you wish. I think we can just unmute. Or Linda, please go ahead. I see your hand.
Okay, well, I'm not any of those, but I want to say, first of all, Reverend Walton, I truly appreciate you sort of recognizing how your story may have been different if you had a different body, if you were a woman or otherwise. And I wish we did more of that, just seeing how, our life's experiences are not the same because of how we're read by other people and other forces. But that's my just a thank you for that. But I wanted to ask you a question. I hear you advocating for religion as a means to well-being, sort of re-embracing our religious selves. And I want to ask you about the possibility that maybe other incarnations of that. And an example I'm thinking about is this, that oftentimes education isn't exactly a place, being educated, where our whole selves are welcome. And could it be that the lack of wellness we see is this chronic denial of our whole selves in all our God-given diverse ways of being? If education was more a space where we could be our whole selves, could that accomplish greater well-being in your model of it? Or do you feel more religion is the means? Can you say some maybe speak to that? Does that make sense?
It does make sense, and thank you very much for that. And actually, I know you saw the last part as the question and the first part as a compliment, but I actually want to tie those two together a little bit, because one of the reasons I think that I grew with an awareness to understand the difference of how my body was read in the faith community, of which I had deep appreciation for, was coming into religious spaces on college campuses, including when I was in college, with people who had come from different spaces, and having that community to discuss, hear, and learn from in safe spaces that a college religious faith program, i.e. here at the one I had at Morehouse College, provided me that I would have never found in local congregation. And it was hearing others' stories of pain, of trauma, and the ways that they wanted to be their whole selves, both gay and Christian, for example, and the ways that that was denied to them. And so that's why I link it with this latter part. So yes, part of this is a clarion call for higher education to create more spaces, not a singular space, not one space, but more spaces where where we can have these kind of deliberate dialogues, understanding the varying sliding, shifting categories of identity. Because if we see the space, for example, what's happened on many college campuses, because the university or the college has gotten out of the quote unquote business, they've left it to kind of parachurch and voluntary chaplains and organizations to come into the space who often don't have the theological training, background, and or adhere to the values of the larger institution. And so they end up actually creating tyrannical spaces where students who want to find comfort and can hear the songs and the themes and the messages of their religious background may gravitate to. But yet they can't wrestle with questions over racial or sexual or gender identity. But in some of the best cases I've seen across this country in college ministries and chaplaincies and university churches, it was creating those spaces where thoughtful, well-informed, responsible religious leaders on campus taught students how to read their bodies in ways that I'm still learning each day. So thank you very much for that.
Dean Walton, and thanks. And got a great question that came into the chat. Professor Larkin, if you'd care to articulate rather than having us read it, that'd be awesome.
Yes, well, I just want to thank you for what was a wonderful address. I was wondering if you were thinking that this was very much a modern articulation of John Henry Newman's idea of a university, which very much touches upon many of the themes that you mentioned and the special role of religion and theology in a university context. And if you're trying to put forward a modernized idea of that, and at the same time, you raised a lot of fascinating and interesting questions. One which sort of struck with me, I've educated in Ireland at Trinity College. It was a very strong movement of creating the first multi-denominational chapel in a university setting in Ireland in the 1970s, and embracing really, in reality, secularism as a solution to the problem of sectarianism. That the issue of a very fraught sectarian history of a dominant church and an established church and the tensions between them has resulted in higher education basically saying the easiest solution is we wash our hands of it, we walk away from it, and it's been very difficult to bring that role, let's say, space, which I do know that at Trinity they try to maintain exactly that issue you mentioned. The ethos of the institution is still there in the chaplains, but it's very hard to maintain that when you have those external pressures. And of course, all the scandals that have come with it that become the lens which young people understand faith-based organizations. So those are just some of the observations, but I think that many of the things you mentioned there are perfect, and that wonderful idea of the tension of those two worlds it is a great way of thinking about it.
Well, listen, I really appreciate that. I appreciate those words. And to be honest, probably since I haven't read John Henry Newman since the early 2000s, I could respond to your saying, am I informed by that? Perhaps. Maybe, but I'm not up to date enough, having not read probably in 20 years. And so I actually wrote that down so that I could revisit it. As it relates to the opting out and the examples that you provided and just kind of ceding the space because of sectarian battles, I think we're in a different context here in the United States, and where many have looked to Europe as an example. And when we consider many of the loudest religious voices attempting to influence public policy over the past few decades, that position is understandable. I mean, particularly when we're talking about the exclusive, authoritarian, anti-intellectual tendencies, say, of the religious right, or all of these things that actually belie values of open debate and freedom of expression. But I would also argue that why, as I'm trying to, and as you pointed out, why cede to these particular extreme voices? As an example, I teach, and this is who I am very much informed by, I teach the theological writings of Martin Luther King Jr. as moral and political philosophy. And he, like a Reinhold Niebuhr or a Serene Jones or Elaine Pagels, I mean, they offer viable contrasts to both authoritarian, anti-intellectual, extreme voices on the right and simply opting out. King's a quintessential example. I mean, of someone who demonstrates that religious commitments don't necessarily need to be inconsistent with the normative values, particularly the normative values of modern democracy. This is where those who oppose bringing normative religious commitments into our debates, I mean, they really overreach. Because it's not as if normative ideals and commitments don't undergird liberal democracy. The equality of humanity, checks and balances of government, equal treatment under the law. These are all fundamental, foundational commitments. And when I read the writings of religious thinkers like Abraham Joshua Heschel or Pauli Murray, I see corollary resources based on particular conceptions of the divine that align with these commitments, that align with many of the commitments of our institutions of higher education. Commitment to the equality of humanity. And this is what distinguishes our current and fragile experiment in liberal democracy, but also it informs our moral commitments. And so I don't want to cede the space because of the voices on the extremes, the religious voices on the extremes. I think that we have debates about better voices.
Go ahead, Steve.
Hi, thanks. And thank you, Jonathan, for a very inspiring talk. I want to get your thoughts on a particular space, and that's a more practical space of the classroom. And let me give you a side story, which is a bit selfish and allows me to name drop a bit. So years ago, I was asked to look into issues of academic integrity at our university, in our school at the University of Southern California. And so one of the first people I sought counsel from was Dallas Willard, who's on the faculty there. And he said something very, very wise and very impactful to me. And he said, if you want to have students not violate any rules, you need to show them the value of their work. If you show them that what they're doing has value, then that is really a big part of your job. So I wanted you, if you could speak on how, beyond just you got the correct answer, how do we in the classroom provide that sense of value to the students?
That question could be answered a million different ways, and I'm sure every box on this screen could offer an answer that's probably better than mine. If I were to stay in my lane here, one of the things that I try to do is to learn a little bit about the intellectual traditions that inform the student and that they bring to the classroom with them, so that they are not feeling, excuse me, let me put it this way, so that I'm not exacerbating this sense of imposter syndrome that we all feel, particularly on our campuses. This is one of the reasons that I started off my talk today in this space, talking about my first intellectual tradition being the Black churches of my youth. Because for so long, after I left Morehouse College, in other spaces, that was not affirmed by anyone as having any intellectual import whatsoever. And so rather than being able to reference aside maybe from a King or a Thurman, but not a Pauli Murray, or not a Jarena Lee, not a Mary McLeod Bethune, or Ella Baker or Fannie Lou Hamer. Proud intellectuals that were shaped by their religious context, particularly African-American Protestant context. In order to be smart, I was having to appeal to a Reinhold Niebuhr, or a Stuart Hall, or a Raymond Williams. But it was when I actually got with faculty in graduate school, after submitting one too many bad papers with paragraph long sentences with 3 semicolons in them, trying to imitate somebody else's writing, rhetorical, expressive style, that I had a professor talk to me about my own intellectual background and pushed me to where I started talking openly about preachers of my childhood, about Sunday school teachers, about attention to text in those spaces. And it was when that person, that scholar, very distinguished scholar, affirmed that. It was actually, I'm sorry. I wasn't going to say his name, but I want to say his name just to honor him, because we just lost him. It was Professor Albert Rabbitoe. When Professor Rabbitoe did that, I can say that it changed the trajectory of my academic career, because it changed immediately my sense of self and my sense of worth and my sense of value. So thank you, my dear brother, for taking that advice and showing value to your students in the classroom.
My delight. We have at least 4 folks in the queue. I think we'll have to bring this to a sad halt after that. But John, if you don't mind hanging out for 4 more questions/comments. I've got Giselle Ragusa, Manuel Dolder, Pankaj Chandra, and Michael Bradford. Giselle.
Oh my goodness. Of course, just when I'm ready to ask my question, it says my internet is unstable. So I'll give it my best and hopefully the question will come across. I actually want to get back to something that the dialogue. First, I want to thank you, Dean Walton, for your inspiring talk. It really was thought-provoking in so very many ways, particularly, I think, for those of us that have projects funded by the coalition and really thinking about character development, et cetera. One thing that I kind of want to get back to what Linda was talking about, this notion of tension, and your words used. I'm not certain which of you actually use these words, but I heard a couple of times this notion of opting out when it comes to religion. But in your speech, you talked a bit about creative tension. And I think constantly, and Steve and Dean Yorthos can attest to this, about young adult development when it frames the work that I do in both research and classroom practice, and certainly in the projects we have funded from the coalition. And that is that when students are in their undergraduate years in particular, they're developing their identity, and we have a responsibility to help them with that, but also to enable and facilitate it. So when I think about this notion of opting out of their beliefs, spiritual beliefs, et cetera, with which they might have been raised, as you referenced in the beginning of your talk, I'm just wondering, rather than thinking of it as opting out, are they not, as they often do in identity development, as they begin to separate from their family and others who help to bring them to the college experience, question everything? And one of those big questions they have relates to their own spirituality, their upbringing as it relates to spirituality, religion, etc. In our university, as you might know, we have it's a large, very large private university, very much globally focused with students from all over the world. And therefore, along with that, we have very much diversity in religion as well and spiritual beliefs. And so I wonder your thoughts on this notion of creative tension coming as a part of this whole questioning of everything that they've grown up with, that they've experienced as they develop their individual identity, and this notion of this role we might play in helping them to understand that some of their past experiences frame their belief system, even if they're questioning it, and embracing them in talking about those things. Because I heard from your very beginning of your talk that you talked about those early experiences, and those really hit home to me as part of my early experiences as a biracial student growing up in Los Angeles as well. And so I also study creativity and innovation, and I always think of it from the standpoint of a learning perspective, and how that tension in learning inspires, paired with creativity, it inspires innovation, but it also inspires identity development, period. So I wonder what your thoughts on that sort of whole framework for student development, given your immense experiences in various roles, most often in leadership, but across the spectrum.
I have a 17-year-old son who has declared to his mother and I that he is not religious. Right? He's declared his mother and I he's not religious. He's a theater kid. He's an artist. He is a beautiful soul, creative personality. And I got wind of the essay he was writing preparing for his college applications. He's a senior in high school at the University of North Carolina School of the Arts. And in his essay, he talked about what it means to be a queer theater Black kid, having grown up in a religious background, right? And now he's fleeing to art as a response to the confining religious world, right, of his upbringing. And I read that and I was like, boy, you grew up in the Memorial Church of Harvard University, of which half the clerical staff was queer, self-identified. Right? I was like, what are you talking about? No. And before I could get through with that, my wife put up her hand and told me to be quiet. Of which later she said to me, he's creating his distance. He's establishing his distance from you. Okay. Let him have it. All of the people who he loves, all of the people who he admires, many of which were in that letter as well, were people that were a part of all of his multiple religious faith communities. Let's just keep setting the table. That was my wife's quote. Let's just keep setting the table. And you actually, my dear sister, I just thank you for that, because you gave me a framework to think about that in relationship to my own child. And if I were to apply it to what I'm talking about, that's it. Trying to set the table on our campuses for children kids like him who are coming into these spaces, separating themselves, trying to figure it out. Yes, that is it's what we want to do.
Sure. Thank you. Incredibly helpful. Thanks so much.
This particular table could not be more beautifully or enduringly set. I am sad to say that as we have run past the allotted time, we've got to move on. But my goodness, these words and this exchange as well will linger with us across these 2 days and for a long time after. Dean Walton, in whatever form is available to us through Zoom, we owe you a great debt of gratitude for setting the table with such wonderful gifts.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. And I'm so sorry we couldn't get to all of the questions. Please feel free to email me, anybody, because even this dialogue, I've been actively taking notes because this conversation has made me better, smarter, more precise. I appreciate you.
It is a mutual appreciation for sure. And we will now move back to Keith Buffington to tell us what's next with Jonathan Lee Walton's Words in Our Hearts.